And there it is. Bitcoin has just set in a new year-to-date high. So hey everyone, welcome back to Upside Down Data. Today I want to talk about Bitcoin and what has been going on in the market. So obviously, as I'm recording this, we just set in a new year-to-date high. We just closed at a new high relative to where we were the previous year-to-date high back here in mid-July. I want to start off by talking a little bit about how we got here. If you were in the market, if you were paying attention to the market just earlier this month, you might remember there was a lot of doom and gloom about Bitcoin and the rest of crypto in the middle of October back here. People were either just getting bored and leaving, or they were saying we're going to nuke down to 23K, 20K, sub 20K, new bottom, you name it. And I actually commented on this on X, where I talked about how engagement was really falling off with crypto content while Bitcoin was still up this massive amount, and that actually seemed like a bullish sign. Oftentimes the crowd is caught off sides, either if they're just not paying attention, or if they are paying attention and they're extremely bearish, which seemed to be the prevailing feeling at the time, that is right for a market to get caught off sides. Looks like that has been playing out. And then I also put a post up here on X talking about why have I been bullish this entire year. So basically this entire year as we're going in, I've been bullish on Bitcoin. I've leaned bullish. If you just go back and watch our content through this entire year, you'll see that I've clearly leaned on the bullish side the entire time. And the reason for that was just that the data were telling me that that's what made sense. For example, what I'm showing you here is our forecast model. And that had been bullish on Bitcoin this entire year. It still is bullish on Bitcoin. And that's one of the things that I talked about, is that this is bullish, this is leaning bullish. That is a sign that maybe that's the direction we should be taking. Basically, it was seeing way better than 50-50 odds that Bitcoin would be up 6 months in the future at each of these points. And indeed, we've seen Bitcoin moving up and up and up, now sitting in new year-to-date highs. So that's something that I think I just wanted to mention, is that there's a lot of sentiment that happens in markets based on price movements. As price moves down, people panic. People get really scared. They think things are going to go lower. And that can create a lot of noise. But sometimes that's a lot of noise that's just simply not backed up by the data. And so for me personally, I would rather follow the data than follow the whims of the crowd. Obviously not financial advice, you should make your own opinions, but that is how I've been navigating the markets. And so far, it's been working quite well. So I want to talk about a few of our other models in a minute here, but first I want to talk a little bit more looking at the Bitcoin chart. So I'm going to go ahead here and get rid of that line that was just indicating the prior year-to-date high. And let's just zoom out and look at where we stand right now. So now that we've cleared above that range, we've even cleared above the ranges that we were in back in May and June of 2022. And really, there's not a whole lot to cut through here. We're really just getting back to the range that we're in back here in 2021, kind of this range between 30K and around 40K. And so based on that, it might be reasonable to think that Bitcoin could have 40K in its sights, somewhere up in this general region. Now, there are different things that we can look at to also look at what important levels might there be. So one of the things I want to show you here is the volume profile for Bitcoin ever since basically back here, the beginning, in the late 2020, then going into 2021. And so we can see that this range here, obviously a ton of volume transpired throughout this whole time. Now we're breaking above. We've cleared above this last big chunk of volume that transpired. And the reason that we care about this, where volume has transpired, is that it's an indicator of where people's cost bases might be. That when there's a lot of activity, it's a lot of people who were exiting, a lot of people who were entering, and some of those people might still be holding on. Or at the very least, it indicates points that have acted as important levels for the market, or a lot of volume has changed hands, a lot of people thinking it's an important place to maybe be selling or buying. But now we've gotten into a little bit of a lull, and the next big spike up that we see is up closer to 40K, somewhere in the 37 to around 40K range. And so that's one thing that we can look at to think that maybe there's some at least clearer skies ahead of us before we get to that level. Now, I'm not saying that we're just going to go immediately to that level necessarily. These are markets. They tend not to just go one direction only or up only. But it does seem like a reasonable upside target to look for. And with this kind of momentum, anything is really possible. We're going to have to wait and see, but this is quite a breakout. The other thing that's heartening to see today is the amount of volume that transacted, or I should say yesterday technically here on the daily close, the amount of volume that took place on this breakout, that there was a huge amount of volume that pushed us up above this resistance from this last year-to-date high and really got us up into this new realm. And the reason that's important is it means that a lot of people were probably selling here, that the sellers got exhausted and there was so much demand, it overpowered the bears, it overpowered the sellers and got us past that resistance. And then the hope would be that if we continue moving to the upside, maybe we do come back down at some point and retest these levels, retest this. But the idea would be that hopefully then we'd be able to turn it into support. And instead of just falling right through it all the way down to newer lows, we could actually consolidate on it, bounce off of it, and then move further up to the upside. In fact, I would see that as maybe even being a more bullish setup than just continuing to rip. Because if we just continue to rip, things are likely to get overheated. You might see us slice down pretty aggressively. But I think we have a more measured move up, come back down, hold this level of support, and then continue moving up. That might allow for a more sustained rally. Now, it's not to say that has to happen. Certainly, we could just continue to rip higher. But in some ways, that might be a healthier market structure to look for and something that I'm certainly going to be looking for also. So one other thing I want to talk about Bitcoin then is one of our models, our short-term UDPI risk model. So if you're familiar with this one, you'll know how to read this, but basically the idea is that higher values are higher risk, lower values are lower risk. And this is the short-term version of this model, which means that it cares about moves that play out over days to weeks, so much more short-term in its time horizon. And one of the things that I think is notable about what the short-term UDPI is doing right now is it's still quite muted. So even when you just compare how high the short-term UDPI got on these previous pumps here, coming into 2023, this first rally up here in January, second rally up here into April, third rally here up in July, we're still below all of those in terms of where those peaks were. And so what that might suggest to me is that we still have room to move if Bitcoin wants to. And instead of being capped off at somewhere around 0 or closer to 1 as being the upside, maybe we have at least there to go, if not further on this rally. And even if we do find a local top at a similar point like we have back here, that's still giving quite a bit of room for the short-term UDPI to move up from here. So that's one of the things I think is bullish in a way of this rally, is it's moved pretty aggressively, but we're still not at a point where, at least from the short-term UDPI's perspective, we necessarily expect a local top to be forming yet. And so that's something that I'm going to be watching. And it wouldn't surprise me if we can move up further, or in fact, even go higher into some of these higher levels. So we'll see how it develops. So that's one of the things that I'm watching. So far, so good for sure from the short-term UDPI's perspective. So that's Bitcoin. I also want to talk a little bit about broader ideas about the markets. So if you've been following the broader markets, you'll have seen that certain altcoins have gone ripping. So for example, Solana's done quite well. Link has done extremely well more recently. And so I want to talk about, is this a possibility that we could have more assets also joining in, or will this be more of a Bitcoin only type of affair? And I think when you see these kind of rips out of early, kind of maybe potential early bull market moves, or kind of at least transitioning out of the bear into a potential new bull, oftentimes what you might expect is that that's not really the time for alt seasons to fully form. That alts can join in on the rallies, but oftentimes that altcoins really have their alt seasons after Bitcoin has broken to new all-time highs. Then all those profits from Bitcoin flood into altcoins and just send them absolutely ripping. I mean, that's what we saw back here in 2020. Altcoins certainly moved up out of the COVID lows, but they really went on that mad dash after Bitcoin had gone on its crazy run. And so I think it's reasonable to have a base case that we're not going to see that kind of extreme of an alt season. But I do think it's possible that we do see more altcoins start to join in. Not saying it's going to be a complete alt season, that every single altcoin is going to go ripping. But I do think that it's reasonable to think that there could be some spillover effects, at least on some. And one that I actually want to talk about, not an altcoin, but, well, it depends how you define altcoin. I personally don't define ETH as an altcoin. But I do want to talk a little bit about Ethereum, because Ethereum has been really for a while kind of left for dead by a lot of people in crypto. Not literally, but just in terms of excitement level or bullishness. Everyone is bullish Bitcoin, and a lot of people are just saying that ETH just looks terrible. They don't expect to do anything, expect it's just gonna bleed out. And of course, like I was saying over on X here, when everyone's bored, that might be the time to pay attention. And I think a lot of people have been bored on ETH. Is it time to start paying attention on ETH as well? So if we go over and look at ETH's short-term UDPI, so that's what this is here. So this is the ETH short-term upside downside potential indicator. We can see it's also very muted. It's all the way down here below -1, really sitting down at pretty low levels. Nothing like what we've seen at these higher points as has made its more notable moves in the past here. And so again, if ETH wants to move, it's got plenty of room to move to the upside. Now you might be asking, why would ETH move? Bitcoin has this massive narrative driver behind it. The spot Bitcoin ETF seems like the odds of it getting approved and launching are increasing and increasing. That's a big bullish narrative to drive it further. What does ETH have going for it? Well, in some ways, I actually think ETH could have spot ETF hype going for it also. That if we get a Bitcoin spot ETF, it wouldn't shock me at all if the next thing people start speculating about is, will ETH be next? We've already seen ETH futures ETFs launch. And so if Bitcoin gets a spot ETF, probably wouldn't see like that big of a stretch to think that ETH could also potentially get a spot ETF at some point. And so it wouldn't shock me to see that hype kind of move off of Bitcoin and maybe start finding its way more, maybe a bit more over towards Ethereum. And one of the things with ETH, when you just look at the chart, that maybe is hopeful for it, if it did get some of that hype directed in its way, if we just again look at the volume profile for ETH, we can see that if it can get above its prior year-to-date highs back here from April, there's just not nearly as much volume it needs to clear to. It has room to run after this 2K level. And I think the short-term UDPI for it is telling a similar story. It's got quite a bit of room to run if it wants to do so. So obviously that's very much speculative. There's no guarantees. So obviously not financial advice, anything like that. But I do think that it's always something to keep an eye on, is that it's easy to get caught up in the FOMO of whatever is ripping right now, in this case, Bitcoin. And that doesn't mean that Bitcoin can't go higher. But oftentimes when there's that one coin that everyone's excited about, everyone's talking about, as I was saying on X, that's actually can be a cue that maybe you want to start paying less attention to that asset and start directing your attention elsewhere. What's the next asset that could potentially happen to, assuming that broader bullish sentiment is going to continue to prevail? And so that's one of the things that I'm going to be personally thinking about as we go here. Obviously, you're going to need to see what Bitcoin does from here. But if Bitcoin does manage to hit those upside targets closer to, for example, 40K, then what I'm going to be wondering is, okay, is it really just going to be a Bitcoin only show, or are there other assets that could start to take some of that hype and then ride them next? And that could be something like ETH, which I think there might be some narratives that could unfold here that would make it be an attractive next option. But there certainly could be any number of other altcoins as well. So time will tell, but that's one of the things that I'm thinking about. So yeah, the final thing that I wanted to mention though, kind of going into this, is a kind of, let's make sure that we're grounded. Let's make sure that we're not just going to get swept away with the FOMO and just think that we're now in a massive bull market going to rip to new all-time highs. Could happen, but I think there's other things that we have to consider here. And one of the things that I think we have to keep in mind is that as Bitcoin goes up and potentially hits some of these higher resistance zones, then there is the potential for Bitcoin to not just continue riffing off to new all-time highs. I think one of the benefits that we have going for Bitcoin right now is that we got to a point where everyone was just so bearish that no one really even believed this rally at all. And in fact, probably a lot of people still don't believe it. I talked about this in the last video I made about Bitcoin, that as we were doing this, as we were ripping to the upside, we were seeing in the derivatives market a lot of people piling in on the short side. They were betting against it. They thought we were just going to collapse. Well, that probably just added fuel to the fire, ripped us off to the upside here. But I want to imagine a scenario where Bitcoin does, I'm just going to go ahead and just draw some lines here. Let's say Bitcoin does just kind of, keep going up, and gets into some of these higher ranges, these 40K ranges, maybe even higher, maybe the mid 40Ks. We see Bitcoin start ripping off to the upside like this, and these are just obviously squiggles on the chart, but let's just imagine something like that were to play out. One thing you might imagine is that everyone suddenly might flip their narrative, that all the bears out there, or a lot of them, might decide to give up and just say, all right, I was wrong, time to be bullish, we're going to rip off to the upside. And it's that kind of environment where you then might expect the steam to run out and Bitcoin to fall off. And so that's one of the things that I just wanted to mention, that for me personally, I'm going to be watching what the market how the market's reacting to what Bitcoin is doing. And that will probably be showing up in the data as well. I suspect if Bitcoin did something like that, that the short-term UDPI for Bitcoin would start getting really overextended, which would be a suggestion that we could be falling off. But I think it's also useful just to keep an eye on emotions, your own emotions and everyone else's emotions. And if everyone starts getting super euphoric up in here, and especially if they're doing that while the data starts pointing in the opposite direction, that's where I personally would start getting really cautious, really concerned, and thinking that maybe a deeper correction is needed to really kind of reset things, and then finally, maybe later, set up a bigger move to the upside down the road. And then, of course, there's always the continual caveats of if a recession hits, then we have no idea what is going to happen. Bitcoin's never seen a full-on recession, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. But at least for now, with what I'm seeing in the data, things are looking good. And this is really, in some ways, vindication of what the data have been saying all along. That the data were telling us this entire time, ever since back here, that Bitcoin was being bullish was probably a more reasonable position than being bearish. And yet, and here we are, proving that point as we go. So I'll be continuing to watch the data, see what they say, and then also continue to watch the market and see when things might be getting a little bit too euphoric for their own good. All right, if you like the content, or subscribe to the channel, give the video a like and follow us on Twitter. And if you want to view live data from our models and more, you can go to our website, polaritydigital.io. And then if you sign up for our Polarity Digital Pro subscription service, access to all of our model data live and more.